We're joined now in our discussion by Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff of California. He is the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee. And Congressman Schiff, you're here to talk about other things. We will get to some of those, but I need to get your reaction tonight to what you've just heard the President of the United States as a candidate for president 2 months before the election in a conversation with his personal lawyer about creating a company to make payments to silence a woman who claims she had a one-year relationship with Donald Trump.
Well, Lawrence, what leaps out at me as a former prosecutor are a few things that seem apparent. The first is quite obvious. The president had knowledge that they were going to be making these payments. So Giuliani's earlier claim was patently false, that the president didn't know about this at the time. Clearly, he has knowledge. He's not surprised at all when this topic is brought up. Second, it's brought up in the context of things they need to make go away until the election. So they talk about the divorce proceedings, and the president says, well, we only need to make that go away for 4 weeks. And Cohen says, well, don't worry, it'll go away for longer than that. And that's the context in which this is brought up. So it's an effort to basically prevent voters from getting this information. And that's important as to the issue of, was this a campaign expenditure? And then finally, I would say on the issue of an expenditure for the campaign, the whole purpose of setting up this company to make this payment is to conceal the payment. So to me, whether it's cash or check is less material than the fact they're using this organizational structure to hide the payment. If they were planning on reporting it as a campaign expenditure, there'd be no need to set up that company. So to me, as a prosecutor, former prosecutor, I'd say you have evidence of knowledge, you have evidence of an intent to violate the campaign laws, you have evidence that this was about concealing information for a campaign purpose. So that's how I think that the prosecutors would look at this.
And to add some campaign context to the discussion that we hear on this tape, it begins, Michael Cohen's portion of the tape begins with him talking about poll numbers in the presidential campaign. He opens it up as a campaign discussion. The next thing he talks about is troubling information that the New York Times is trying to obtain about President Trump's first divorce, his first divorce from his first wife. The president said, and they talk about how we only have to get by the next 2 months with this. That same timing issue was present in the discussion about the president's first divorce. And so there seems to be a very clear campaign focus in this conversation.
I think that is abundantly clear. And I also think, you know, in terms of who brings up cash, this is Giuliani trying to get out ahead of this very damaging tape by characterizing it or trying to create a doubt in the public mind. Whereas if people just heard that tape without his preview, there wouldn't be any question that it's Donald Trump who at least appears on this tape to be suggesting that they make the payment in cash.
What does this do to complicate the president's position in considering an interview with Robert Mueller?
Well, I don't think this really has that much bearing on that question. I think that the president's legal team has already concluded there's no way they're going to put him in front of someone where if he lies, he could be held criminally liable. They just can't have any confidence that he could get through a whole interview without making false statements, particularly on the subject of Russia or obstruction of justice. So we see this moving playing field with Giuliani saying, well, first we'd need this to put him before you for an interview, then we'd need that. The most latest preposterous proposal is, we'll let you ask about collusion, but not about obstruction. We'll let you ask him questions that he can only answer no collusion, no collusion, no collusion. But beyond that, that's the length and breadth of what we're willing to submit. The bottom line is, if Mueller wants to interview him, he needs to issue a subpoena. That's the only way that's going to happen.
And what would you expect to happen next? If Robert Mueller knows that the president is never going to actually, in a cooperative way, sit down for an interview, which I assume by now he's figured out, he's seen the Giuliani game played as far as it can go. How does Robert Mueller make the tactical decision of, do I subpoena this president?
Well, look, I think that the Mueller team has probably concluded, and I think they would be right if they do subpoena him, they win that court case. But it takes time, and the White House view, and they may not be wrong about this, is time is working on their side. The longer they can draw this out while appearing to blame Mueller for it, the longer in the public mind the Russia investigation has been going on, and the more appetite there is for the president's argument it's time to bring this to an end. So Mueller is, in a way, fighting the clock. And is he prepared to use up the amount of time it would take to litigate this? How much value does he think he would get from that presidential interview? I assume that's what he's debating. There is a finite number of witnesses on the obstruction issue. And by now, I would imagine Mueller has interviewed almost all of them. It's not like the conspiracy or collusion issue in which there are witnesses all over the globe. This is a discrete number. And I think the decision that he's trying to make is this something we want to try to present to the Justice Department in the next month prior to the blackout period, or are we prepared to litigate this and push it until after the election?
One final point on the subpoena question. You said that Robert Mueller has every reason to believe that if he issues the subpoena, he wins after the president appeals the issuance of the subpoena. That appeal could conceivably go to what would be a Supreme Court where there are 2 Trump justices. Would a prosecutor today be as confident of winning with a Supreme Court that could include Justice Kavanaugh?
Well, there'd certainly be reason for more concern than there should be. The precedent, I think, is fairly clear, but you have someone who's been very outspoken, that is Kavanaugh, about presidential power, about how presidents should not be subject of investigation or prosecution while they're in office. Someone who's talked about overturning the very precedents that we're talking about. So, it certainly seems very realistic to imagine that this is why Donald Trump picked this judge. Of all of the candidates that the Federalist Society put forward, he picked the one most likely to rule in his favor in any dispute between he and the special counsel should it get to the Supreme Court. But I still think he wins. That is, special counsel wins if this goes to litigation because the precedent is simply too clear.
Congressman Adam Schiff, thank you very much for joining our breaking news coverage tonight. Really appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.